Before we get started, let me introduce not only the man in the center, U.S. Senator Tim Scott, but also to his right is my colleague Jamie Lovegrove. You've read his work before in the Post and Courier. He's out of our Columbia Bureau, which we do have because we believe in the power of journalism across the state. And when it comes to politics, we need people like Jamie in Columbia holding people in power accountable. So I'm really happy that he's here with us today. So thank you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started now. We're going to start our conversation off with the latest news of the weekend and of the day, news that's been on a lot of people's hearts and minds. Over the weekend, we saw 2 mass shootings committed in the span of 13 hours in El Paso, Texas, and in Dayton, Ohio. As a U.S. Senator, and as one whose hometown witnessed a mass shooting here just 4 years ago, in which you lost one of your friends, what is needed to stem the carnage of America's mass shooting epidemic?
First, let me just say to the Post and Courier, thank you for allowing me to participate in this Pints in politics. Thank you very much. And to the crowd, my bosses. God bless you. How's everybody doing? Excellent. I will tell you that we may or may not agree on all the issues, but we're going to have a lively conversation. I'm going to be completely transparent, and I think we'll have a chance to hopefully get to some of the root challenges that our nation faces, and at the same time, celebrate some of the successes that our nation is going through right now as well. So I think it's good for us to celebrate the good and to talk about the bad at the same time. So to the question that is an important question, what do we do as a nation? I would like to tell you that there is something specific, that there is a panacea to hate. I don't know what the panacea is. I don't have that panacea. There certainly are a number of initiatives that you will hear from elected officials on both sides of the aisle that will be considered. I have suggested going back to D.C., so I would rather have a rainy, almost hurricane day in Charleston than a sunny day in D.C. So I would much rather be here under all circumstances, save one. When the loss of so many people requires us to go back, we should be back talking about, fighting over, debating how to make progress. My answers are pretty simple. First one is, when you study the profile of the mass shooters, you come to the conclusion that most mass shooters, 40%, not most, 40% of mass shooters have a medical diagnosis of a mental disorder. 70% of mass shooters are mentally unstable. If we're going to start anywhere in the conversation and we don't start with the shooter and analyzing the shooter, I think we're on the wrong page, personally. The second thing I would say is that there are a ton of studies. I've been reading through studies for about 2 years on this issue, probably 3 years in earnest, 2 years specifically drilling into gun violence, mostly because of Clemente Pinckney and the Manual 9. But generically speaking, if you think about this number, 2016, we had 38,600 gun-related deaths in America. Almost 39,000 deaths by guns. The number one culprits, the number one category of those deaths were about 22,500 were suicides. About 14,000 were homicides, and 71 were the result of mass shootings. So here's my theory. We should have a conversation, a robust conversation around mass shootings. But we should have a serious, deep dive into gun violence, starting with mental illness, if in fact 64%, 65% of gun violence is someone taking their own lives?
But your sign doesn't say anybody with mental illness can't come in. Your sign
So-
says if you don't have a gun, you can't come in.
So at the end of the day, like I said, I'm happy to have a conversation or a debate on the topic. I'm going to give you my views. I'm not expecting a group this size to be on my side or the other side. I'm expecting for us to have a conversation or at least listen to where I'm coming from. And frankly, if you disagree with me, I get it. I absolutely get it. But that's my first position on guns. We can talk about the issue, and I hope that we dive into it beyond just mass shootings, because the issue is critically important generically throughout this country, specifically to our community as the survivors of a mass shooting. So it's a really important issue. You can politicize it. That would be the wrong thing to do. We can pass laws that make you feel better, but won't make you safer. That's a part of the challenge as well.
So we have about 40 minutes. We want to cover a lot of ground, and the fewer interruptions we have, the more ground we'll be able to get to. We'll certainly try to cover as much of the questions that have been submitted to us as possible, but the more we can move along, the better it will be. We just want to be as respectful as possible. We do want to keep going on that topic real quickly here. So, first of all, you did say you wanted, or you would be ready to go back. Senator Schumer has called for Senator McConnell to call the Senate back, and he has not done so. Would you like him to go ahead and do that? Are you frustrated he hasn't? And if you were to go, there are several proposals that are waiting in the Senate right now that have already passed the House. There's a universal background checks bill. There's a bill that supporters say would close the Charleston loophole in terms of FBI background checks. What types of legislation, if you were to go back today, would you like to see moving forward?
I would, of course, obviously start with the mental health checks. I think there's Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal are working on red flag laws, which have the same impact. There's a universal background check bill that is passed the House and has not been taken up in the Senate. It's something that we'll probably consider. I have not looked at that legislation, so I won't pretend to be an expert. The questions that arise to the top very quickly has to do with family transfers, personal sales. There's a lot that you have to understand and appreciate beyond the concept of universal background checks. Typically, the definition of universal background checks is not universal. There are lots of exceptions, so I think that's an important consideration. As it relates to the Charleston loophole, myself, Senator Cornyn, Senator Murphy Democrat from Connecticut, we were able to pass legislation called Fixed NICS, which of course Dylan Roof was able to get the gun because the NICS system failed our community and failed this nation. Fixing that, creating penalties for it is a significant step forward. We've done that. We've also, which almost never catches the media's attention, we passed just a couple of years ago after the shootings in Texas, we passed gun violence legislation sponsored by Hatch that provides $100 million a year to provide more resources for school shootings. We also increased in the last omnibus from about $400 million to $1.1 billion to provide more money so that local municipalities and school districts will have the resources necessary to make the decisions that they think is best to provide for more school safety. That has been the focus of our gun legislation in the last couple of years. In addition to that, the Fixed NICS, which I think goes a long way towards the Charleston loophole. Those are pieces of legislation that we have supported, we have passed, and I mentioned at the beginning the legislation that I think that we will be under consideration.
I have a question for you, Senator. That's okay. Staying once more on this topic, to your critics, in 2014 and in 2016, you received a combined $13,450 from the NRA. What impact, if any, will this have on your willingness to take up gun control legislation moving forward?
Well, yeah, so in 2016, I raised about $7 million. I got $3,500 from the NRA. In my 18 elections, the NRA has given me $13,500 or about $1,200 election. I don't work for the NRA, they don't work for me, they have no impact on my decisions. Frankly, when you think about the actual gun debate in South Carolina, the majority of our citizens are in the same position that I am on the guns, so I don't know how to answer a question about a $3,500 contribution out of $7 million to suggest that there's somehow NRA has some outsized influence because they gave you $3,500 when you raised over $7 million.
Jamie's got our next question.
All right, so we will move on to a different topic, a topic I know you will want to talk about, opportunity zones.
Take your time.
So this is a piece of legislation that you included in the tax bill at the end of 2017. It was one of the things you talked to President Trump about after Charlottesville, which we will get to a little bit later. I will try to limit you here. If you could give us the elevator pitch in a minute or so.
I'm going to time it, actually.
For what opportunity zones are and why you believe they could be so revolutionary for the American economy.
So no filibustering on the questions you like. I understand what you're saying. So for me, the simple elevator pitch on opportunity zones comes down to, is there a way to help the most distressed communities in our country by attracting private sector money back into the most impoverished communities, where the average poverty rate is 31% and our national poverty rate is 12.5%. If the answer is yes, and I think the answer is we can do something about that, opportunity zones provides the best vehicle through a tax deferment. You still have to pay the tax, but you actually get to pay it later if you will make a long-term investment in one of the poorest communities in the country. I think there's a lot of potential trapped in those communities, but they don't see the day of light because simply it's too far away from the opportunities. So if we could bring the opportunities back to the neighborhoods in this community where I grew up, to God be the glory and to the people be the benefit. That's it.
You did it. 1 second over. You did it. You did it.
All right, so I want you to address some of the criticisms that some economists have had with the program, maybe its limitations, and I've kind of boiled it down to 4 primary concerns, and I'm just going to go through all of them instead of going one by one. The first is the zone selection process and what is considered an opportunity zone, the criteria.
Let me answer that.
Okay, because and if I will just,
it's easier to do
that's
one
fine.
at a time.
That's fine. And if I could just mention, we are in an opportunity zone right now, and there might be some folks who would wonder whether this is really a distressed community.
Well, today this community is being refurbished in ways that was not possible a decade ago. So the fact that we see some activity in a zone is not to suggest that the zone doesn't still need help, but the governors of each state designated 25% of their most distressed communities defined by the new market tax credit to be eligible for the opportunity zones.
Okay. Another concern folks have had are to do with sort of frictional costs, that companies are going to end up spending a lot of money on lawyers, on accountants, trying to figure out how to get projects to be eligible for opportunity zones, and that for a lot of companies it may not end up being worth it, given those extra costs. Are you worried about that?
So I'm not worried about that so far. So far we have about $29 billion, B as in boy, flowing through 140 different opportunity funds targeting those distressed communities. So the projects are already up. I was in Dallas, Texas on Monday, a $400 million project creating 2,000 jobs in the poorest parts of Dallas. East of Chicago, 3,000 new employees, renovations going on in every single state that I've gone through on my National Opportunity Tour. We're seeing a lot of development. Sure, it's going to be difficult for some, but the worst thing to bringing in new dollars is continuing decay because of no dollars coming into the community. So the fact that you have a vehicle, it's not a panacea, but it certainly will help more people than doing nothing. And it does. We didn't hire a single bureaucrat. We are not having another government dollar go into those communities that's not already targeted there. We're actually targeting private sector dollars to do what it does best, which is create jobs and improve lives, and at the same time, get a return on their investment.
So, that one ties in well. The fact that there are no government dollars being spent on this, it's all about private development and tax incentives. The third concern that economists have had, it has to do with displacement. And I guess, you might talk about gentrification. If you are bringing in this development, that is going to benefit certain folks, but it might hurt others. It might benefit homeowners whose property values might go up, but for renters, their rent might go up, and there is no provision in this legislation for affordable housing to ensure that people who are displaced because of that development can stay in the neighborhoods that they've lived in their entire lives.
An interesting article today, I think it was today in the Post and Courier or yesterday, about the $1.1 billion expansion to improve I-26 and 526 and the negative impact it will have on some communities and the positive impact it will have on traffic. Anyone in here who doesn't think traffic is an issue, please see me later. But so there's always the chance of something negative coming out of it. What I would say is that when you look at the 8,700 opportunity zones around the country, 4%, 4% shows any signs of gentrification. The good news is that about almost 60% of the people own their property, which means that this wealth gap that we're very concerned with as a country is starting to close when their property values go up. The last thing I would tell you is that the zoning issues of density that can help to keep the prices down on housing, having a higher density, is controlled by the municipalities. One of the reasons why we did not embed the opportunity zone legislation with certain requirements is A, it repels capital, and B, the cities have the power to make any kind of zoning changes they believe is necessary to protect the existing community. Case in point is Mayor Knox White in Greenville that's doing a $75 million opportunity zone project that includes affordable housing, workforce housing, and $1 million condos.
And then the final one, and we will move on to another topic, but we have the author of this legislation here and someone who I think is probably what you consider maybe your proudest accomplishment so far in Congress. So we do want to probe you on this. The last concern I've been hearing is that it is going to end up mostly benefiting projects that are already under construction or are already in the works, and that partly because of the time frame that the investors need to start investing, that it's only going to make sense for things that were already moving forward anyway, and now they're going to get this great tax advantage even though they would have moved forward anyway.
Well, there's a reason why the poorest areas of the country have been the poorest areas of the country for decades, because it hasn't seen any actual new dollars. So the question is, if you find a way to bring more dollars into an area that has not seen growth in a generation or two, is that a bad thing? My answer is not a bad thing. Is it the way to fix everything? The answer is no. But it is, in fact, having a positive impact. We're seeing a lot of positive development. The most important development is not the real estate, it's the job creation. If we're able to create jobs in neighborhoods where there were no jobs and you can now walk to work, you can now become a part of commerce in your neighborhood, that's a really good thing.
We're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about rhetoric. Rhetoric, we are. The president did support your opportunity zone legislation, very proudly stood next to you, but the president has also caused his share of headaches for lawmakers like yourself. Republican members of Congress, like yourself, are frequently asked about the president's words and his tone and his rhetoric. After Charlottesville, you met personally with him in the White House. And last week, after the president was making his recent comments about Baltimore, you said, and I quote, "These tweets make my life harder." Could you tell us how the president's tweets make your life harder? And do you need to have another conversation one-on-one with the president?
So two things, I'll tell you from my perspective, the Charlottesville comments were something that I found offensive, and so I told the president that I thought they were offensive. We had a real conversation about why I thought they were offensive. He didn't agree with me, I didn't agree with him, but he asked me a very important question at the end of the conversation, which caught me by surprise, frankly. If you're criticizing the President of the United States, specifically this president, he doesn't always have a positive reaction to criticism. So his reaction was, show me how to do something positive for the people that you are talking about, and I will consider it. I talked through my opportunity zone legislation, and the president said, Tim, if this will help poor people, disproportionately minorities, count me in. I was not expecting that at the end of that conversation. The second thing I would tell you is that anytime you have a lot of tweets that go out, and a lot of it seems to be centered around the issues of race, as a living, breathing unicorn, a black Republican, it makes my life harder. That's just the way it is. And so I try to respond to his tweets when necessary by being authentic. I don't try to sugarcoat what he says. He's not sugarcoating what he says. But with the attacks on the squad, I thought those were racially offensive tweets. The stuff with Elijah Cummings, I thought those were inappropriate for the president, but not racially motivated. This president. So here's why I say that, and I'm not like the, once again, no, not everyone's going to agree with me, but President Trump attacked John McCain with the same veracity that he did Congressman Cummings. So, and he does, but here's the point. Here's the point. The facts are simple. That when you follow the president as closely as I do, and when you've spoken out against the things that he has done that I find offensive, I try to call balls and strikes. The Cummings situation, at the end of that. Thank you very much. Here's what I like. I like the fact that we want to have a conversation about civility, but we want to be uncivil while we're having that conversation. I do not expect everyone to agree with me, but I'm going to tell you as I see it, and I don't expect everyone to like it, but at least I'm going to give you the authentic truth. So the president and I have had a lot of conversations. The chief of staff and I, since Charlottesville, the chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, and I have had lots of conversations as well. And what I seek to do is to move our country forward by being that person given an interesting task of addressing some of the challenges. And I'll say this at the end, and I'll go to the next question. I'm a guy who has a person in jail today who wanted to kill me. And the reason why he wanted to take me out is because he thought I wasn't helpful to the president enough. I've got another guy in Colorado who's being investigated because he's made threats too. He's made threats because he thinks that I'm not helping the black community enough. So I get to see the raw reality of this infection in our country around the issue of hate, polarization, and making judgments on people without even knowing those people. And that is far more corrosive, far more problematic than anything we've discussed so far, besides the guns.
Quick follow-up on that, sir. The last time that you felt very strongly about issues of race and about gun violence and all of these things, you gave a series of Senate speeches on the floor. Do you see yourself doing something similar again in the future if you feel so called to do so?
I have been studying, one of the reasons why I've been studying the gun violence in our nation for the last 3 or 4 years since I made this speech, the 3 speeches, one speech got most of the coverage, the other 2 did not, is because while I think we are sincerely engaged in a conversation around mass gun violence, what we are not doing, and it's almost as if we don't care enough to do it, having a conversation about inner city violence, about violence that is one-on-one. We're not having a conversation about suicide rates in this nation. We're not having a conversation about domestic murder in this nation. When you go through the 200, this is interesting, if you go through the 252 mass shootings based on the most liberal estimation of mass shootings, what you'll find is, go to Wikipedia, it's easy to find. What you'll find is that the vast majority of those shootings are not public mass shootings. There have been 7 of those basically. The other 244 shootings and murders where 4 or more have been injured, more than, somewhere around 40%, I want to get my numbers right, but somewhere around 40% are domestic suicides and the like. It is a fascinating conversation that we're not having about gun violence in this nation when 23,000 people kill themselves. And we have 14,000 homicides. And when you break the homicides down, you find very quickly that 4 cities are representing about 30% of the homicides in our country. We're not having that conversation, which I think is shameful.
So you mentioned a little earlier that you're somewhat of a unicorn being a Black Republican right now. Specifically, you are potentially in line to be literally the only unicorn in all of Congress. Will Hurd, the congressman from Texas, who is the only African American Republican in the House, announced last week he's going to retire at the end of the term, along with a bunch of other members of the House. We can talk about that too. Yeah. But if he leaves and nobody else wins next year, that would leave you as the only Black Republican in either the House or the Senate. How did we get to that point? Why is that the case? And what does the Republican Party need to do about it?
I guess the first thing to say is it certainly is easier to be the chairman of the Black Republican caucus when you're the only member. Number 1. Number 2, I would say that myself, along with Will Hurd, we have been working on a new project to attract like-minded center-right minorities, millennials, and women into the party through boot camps, trainings, communication experts coming in. So we are in the midst right now. We had some candidates in about 2 weeks ago to help attract more folks to the party who agree with us. Here's what I don't want. I want people to be whoever they are. I think the African American community is consistently a center-right community. We have to overcome some of the challenges of the past in order to be there. I think we're going to get there, and I know that does create fear and trepidation in the hearts of many.
Do you, if I could follow up one on that, you know, you're looking at potentially having the lowest number of African Americans in Congress since Reconstruction, you know, since the Civil War.
I don't think that's right. I would say it this way. I'm not sure that we've had a significantly higher number of African Americans elected to Congress now than at any other time in the history of the country. We may have the lowest number of African American Republicans.
Right, sorry, that's what I meant. That's African American Republicans. And, you know, of course, the Republicans like to talk about their history in Reconstruction after the Civil War as a party and having dozens of African American Republicans. You know, do you, going back to what we were talking about earlier with the president and his tweets making your life harder, has he made your minority recruitment efforts harder?
I will say that the obvious answer for some people in the room would be yes. I would say that we are actually seeing more African American candidates stepping up to the plate around the country than I have in a very long time. And the reason is that while some of his texts have been problematic, and I'm one of the first to call it out, his policy positions have been stellar. And so when you look at the African American community, one of the things you find very quickly, I'll let you laugh so that this is, I'm happy for you. Yeah. Yes. Well, listen, I'll be happy to tell you how stellar it is. This would be great. So, So here's the fascinating thing. Not everyone cares about facts, I'm sure. But for those who do, here's what I'm saying. We all have heard, whether you watch Fox News or CNN, the African American unemployment rate is the lowest recorded in the history of the country. One of the reasons why that is. So, thank you. So one of the reasons, actually under Obama, the African American unemployment rate was almost 9% on average, compared to 6% now. So I'm happy to have that comparison. The second thing I would tell you, I'm happy to let you talk if you want to go on. So the second thing I would say, thank you very much. Second thing I would say is that when you focus on actual wage growth in the country, the bottom 20%, which is disproportionately minority, is having the fastest wage growth. So the average wage growth in our country has been over 3% for quarter over quarter for the last 18 or probably 16 months or so, which is incredibly unusual for our country. But for the bottom 20%, we've had periods of over 5% wage growth. The 6 million jobs that we've created since the passage of the tax reform, 6 million jobs, 50% of those jobs are today occupied by African Americans and Hispanics. When you think about the impact of the opportunity zone legislation, in the opportunity zones where the majority population is minority and more than half of them, wage growth is 8%. Property growth, property valuations are up 20%. Let's go beyond that. When you look at the focus on bringing resources into predominantly minority issues like stem cell, which is almost a universally black disease, this administration approved by legislation that brings in more research, more dollars to focus on the rare blood diseases that's now having an incredibly positive impact. And when you track the number of new drugs coming out for sickle cell anemia specifically, last 3 decades, we have more drugs in the last 18 months coming towards the market than we have in the last 30 years. Let's go beyond that. Let's go to education. When you look at the first time you had the historically black colleges and universities, their presidents and chancellors come to Washington to have a conversation with their leaders about their schools. The first time in the history of the country that happened was 2 years ago. They went to this administration's White House, and their number one ask was to increase the size of the Pell and to have 24/7 Pell Grants, because if you're a first-time college student, you typically, if you take the summer off, there's a higher probability you don't come back. Well, almost $30 million later, because of this administration hearing the requests of the HBCU presidents, we increased the Pell Grant. Number two, we also went to the 24/7, 12-month Pell Grant based on their recommendations. They were so pleased, they came back last year. They were excited about that. They're now planning the next one. So whether it's education, economic opportunity, opportunity zones, healthcare, take a look, compare it, and I'd love to hear what the other side has done other than have a 9% unemployment rate, increase the chasm between the high and propose legislation that will frankly cripple our economy. And this is the funny thing. It's not a black or white thing, it's just economic principle. When the economy gets soft and people get laid off, that consistently, disproportionately impacts poor communities and minority communities. So when your unemployment rate is at 3.7% and you're creating 164,000 jobs this month, 224,000 last month, 75,000 jobs in May, that goes towards those folks who have been long-term unemployed and those folks who are consistently in the minority communities.
We're quickly moving through our questions, but we do still have a significant number, so I just remind us notice that we are trying to get to as many questions as possible, including those that y'all have provided for us. Let's talk about economics briefly. Do you agree with Mark Sanford, your former colleague, that the Republican Party has lost its focus on the deficit?
Yes.
Please continue.
How do you get them to focus on it?
Okay. Well, I think what you heard during the first inauguration was that the president unfortunately, he was very clear on the issue of spending. He said in his second term, he would tackle spending because in order to tackle spending, you actually have to be willing to tackle entitlements. If you're not willing to tackle entitlements, you actually never get to spending. We actually appropriate or approve. I'm sorry, ma'am.
Please. We're trying to get to the questions.
Oh no, I thought we were coming for a civil conversation. My bad. Anyway, so here's the challenge when 27% of the money spent by the federal government is approved on an annual basis. That's a problem. That means that almost 70% or 73% of our funding we don't approve on an annual basis. Why is that the case? It's because our entitlement programs actually eat up more money than we can save on the annual appropriations. The 2009 FY 2019 is lower on that annual appropriation than 2009. Of course, 2009 was the year we had the stimulus, so that's important to note. But if you're going to have a conversation about reducing our long-term debt, which is about $23 trillion, you cannot start without talking about the actual drivers of our debt. And those drivers are simple. So when I came into Congress, we were spending about, and we're spending about $580 billion on Medicare with about an 8% annual increase. We're spending about $700 billion on Social Security with a significant increase with 10,000 baby boomers retiring every single day. We're spending about $400 billion on our veteran benefits. We're spending about $370 on our national debt interest only, and it's at an artificially low, 25-year low interest rate. We're spending somewhere around $350 on our Medicaid programs, and we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Obamacare. When you add all that up, that far outstrips anything that we're doing on an annual basis. Therefore, if we're going to get our arms around our national debt, I think we should do common sense things like tell our people that if you're over 55 years old, you don't have to worry about this part of the conversation. But if you're 54 or younger, you may have to wait 6 months longer for your Social Security payment. We've got to do some common sense things that were done back in the 1980s when President Reagan said in 2009, you're going to have to wait a little longer to get full Social Security benefits. So if we do something like that, we will put ourselves in a position to take seriously our national debt. And then the final thing is that when you grow your economy at 3% versus 1.9%, I'll let you figure out where that comparison comes from, 3%, you actually shave off about $2.5 trillion on your debt. So the fastest way to deal with our debt is to first deal with our entitlements, and second, to continue to grow our economy over 3% so you continue to shave down trillions of dollars off of our debt.
A couple quick reader questions that have been submitted to us, and we're going to have a lightning round to wrap it up. We have about 9 minutes left here. So, a reader question was submitted is about prescription drug costs.
Yes.
You were one of 9 Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee who voted against a bill from Chuck Grassley and Ron Wyden last week, a bipartisan bill to lower prescription drug costs. Why did you vote against it, and what do you think we should be doing about prescription drug costs?
So one of the most important issues that we're going to deal with is the prescription drug price challenges. 9 Republicans voted against it. That means 9 out of 14 voted against it, so only 5 actually voted for it. So how we frame it is really important as well.
It was co-authored by Chuck Grassley.
Right, so he was one of the 5 that voted for it, which means that 9, the majority of his own team, voted against it for a specific reason. What we were basically doing is anyone who's over 65 and has Medicare Part D, as in David, It is the most successful part of Medicare that has been seeing actual consistent plateauing of prices. What it does is it provides a 6% inflationary cap on the price of drugs, which sounds good, but that means that every company that's producing a drug has now been told to increase their drug price by 6% for as long as there's a cap, number one. Number two, and most importantly, which is really interesting, is that what was not capped was the starting price. So if you put a cap on the increase, you're telling companies to increase the price before you get under the cap. So what you ultimately end up with is, if a drug used to cost $100 without a 6% cap, nothing stops the drug companies from taking that $100 drug to $150 so they can now live under a 6% cap. It's kind of common sense. I don't know how we missed that. There were parts of the bill that was really good and really important, like, as an example, having a $3,100 maximum out-of-pocket expense for people on Medicare. That was a fantastic part. I would have voted for that as a standalone. But when I tell drug companies that you have to live under a 6% cap, but you can go ahead and increase the starting price of your drugs, that's problematic.
This is also a reader's question. This comes from one of our Palmetto Politics newsletters. I write it every morning. My colleague Shauna Adcox writes it on Wednesdays for me so I can get a break. But this comes from one of those readers, and they say, flooding is Charleston's #1 threat. Can you find federal funds to help us mitigate flood damage in the short term? The need is immediate.
So the answer is kinda. So the flood insurance problem in downtown Charleston is ridiculous. And it's not going away anytime soon, because when you have a city that is under the sea level, it's a problem, right? So what we've done is, in order to make sure that you still have, there are about 40,000 transactions every single day attached to flood insurance. So what we've done is we've had a short-term extension to make sure that we have the funds so that people can continue to buy homes, move in, and do business on the coast of South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and every place else. The real problem with our funding of flood is that the places where floods happen, they're not buying flood insurance. 50% of flood insurance is purchased by Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. If you just go back and Google where have the major floods happened, what you will find is that in the last decade, the answer is not coastal exposures exclusively. Half of the major floods have happened away from the coast, and those folks are paying $0 into the National Flood Insurance Program consistently.
Is a broader concern that folks have about the cause of the flooding, or one of the causes of the flooding, which is climate change. What are you going to be doing about climate change?
Well, I think this is another area where we're going to have an interesting debate over the next few years as this becomes a more and more important issue. I will say that the technologies that we're seeing on the forefront of discovery, including the carbon capture technologies that are moving in our direction, is a very strong and positive place for us to start.
All right, we're going to transition now to our lightning round because we know we're short on time, so we might do a quick back and forth. So let's go ahead. I'll let Jamie start us off.
Do you have a favorite candidate in the 1st Congressional District race right now?
No.
What are you looking for in a candidate to take on Congressman Cunningham?
A winner?
There you go. Should the South Carolina Republican Party hold a presidential primary in 2020?
I don't think we will. I don't think that there's...
But should they? For the good of the party?
Well, you have to have candidates running against the president in order
Maybe
to
your
have
buddy
one.
Mark will, who knows?
But if you don't have candidates, I'm not going to feed into a narrative that today is false.
That's fair, that's fair.
Who are you most worried about defeating President Trump among the 2020 Democratic primary field?
I think the person who would have the best chance if they get out the primary is probably Cory Booker. He's a smart guy. He is thoughtful most of the time. We agree almost none of the time. And he is very likable all of the time. So I think people typically vote for people they agree with and they like, and not one or the other, but both.
sure it's not a coincidence that he is a big champion of the Opportunity Zones legislation.
That is not a bad thing, but I will tell you the truth though. If you look at the current field of Democrat candidates, the one thing you would think is that Biden has the best chance to be President Trump. I will tell you, watching the debates, I don't think that's accurate. I also think that the policy position on the left, from 70% income tax to 4% wealth tax to taxing financial transactions to the Green New Deal, are all non-starters for the average independent voter, 94% of Republican voters, and a few Democrat voters. So their policy position will not be a winning position if that's what they stick with, so they're going to have a candidate that is actually likable, that has a different policy position.
I think that's the wrap-up music, which is a little frustrating. We'll make this really snappy. I'll just lean in close. How much longer do you see yourself in politics? Are you running for re-election in 2022?
I plan to run for re-election, but that would be my last one if I run.
Really? No interest in running for governor?
No.
And from a 1,000-mile political perspective, if you will, what is something the Republican Party can learn from Democrats, and what is something Democrats can learn from Republicans?
I think the Democrats do a great job of leading with their heart, and I think that's something that we as a party can do a better job of. We may have better solutions from my perspective, but they say it in a way that is easier to digest. So that's something I would say I would love for us to do. And what would the Democrats benefit from the Republican Party?
Yes, sir.
I would say math.
Thank you for not dropping the mic, but you basically did.
Thank you,
Thank you
Senator
all so
Scott.
much for coming out.
Thank you all.